In the heart of the Himalayas, where snow-capped peaks touch the skies and prayer flags dance with the wind, lies the story of a man who dared to dream. A man who rose from poetry to politics, from prison cells to the prime minister's chair. And yet, lived a life so simple that even kings looked upon him with wonder. This is the story of Bishweshwar Prasad Koirala, the first elected prime minister of Nepal, and perhaps one of the most humble leaders the modern world has ever known. The year was 1914. The world was at war. But far away in Varanasi, India, in a quiet Brahmin household, a child was born. His name was Bishweshwar Prasad Koirala, or simply BP Koirala. Few could imagine that this child would one day challenge centuries of autocratic rule in Nepal, and ignite the flames of democracy in the Himalayan kingdom. BP grew up in an atmosphere of learning and culture. His father, Krishna Prasad Koirala, was a social reformer, exiled from Nepal for his political beliefs. From the very beginning, BP understood what it meant to be punished for ideas, to be cast out for the sake of principle. And so, the seeds of rebellion were sown early in his heart. But rebellion did not come in the form of anger. It came first, in the form of words. For BP Koirala was not just a future statesman, he was a poet, a novelist, a dreamer who painted with language. He believed that words had the power to move nations. And in time, they did. As BP grew older, the shadow of the Rana regime in Nepal loomed darker. For centuries, the Ranas had ruled Nepal with an iron fist, reducing kings to figureheads and the people to mere subjects. BP could not accept this. He joined India's freedom movement against the British, not only as a nationalist, but as a believer in the universal right to freedom. Picture this. A young man marching in the streets of India, shoulder to shoulder with giants like Jawaharlal Nehru and Mahatma Gandhi. He tasted prison for the first time, not in his homeland but in the struggle for a neighbor's freedom. In those cells, BP discovered something profound, that freedom was indivisible. To fight for India was to fight for Nepal, for humanity itself. This was the making of a revolutionary. But unlike many, BP's revolution was always clothed in simplicity. He rejected grandeur, rejected wealth, rejected personal ambition. For him, power was never the destination, only the instrument. In 1951, history shifted. The Rana regime collapsed under the weight of people's movements, and Nepal began to awaken. BP Koirala returned to his ancestral land, not as an exile but as a leader. The air was electric with possibility. Could Nepal finally join the modern world of democracy? But freedom is never gifted. It is fought for, carved into reality. BP founded the Nepali Congress Party, a movement that was not just political but spiritual. It called upon farmers, workers, students, poets, the heartbeat of Nepal, to rise and claim their voice. Democracy was no longer a dream whispered in the dark. It was a banner carried in the streets. And then came 1959. Nepal held its first democratic elections. The people spoke with overwhelming clarity. And BP Koirala, the poet, the prisoner, the dreamer, became the nation's first elected prime minister. But unlike so many who ascend to high office, BP did not change his ways. He lived simply. He ate modestly. He traveled without extravagance. In fact, stories spread of the prime minister walking barefoot in his garden, or meeting dignitaries without the pomp expected of a world leader. He was, in every sense, a servant of the people. He did not seek to be a king among men. He sought to be a voice among equals. His mission was to transform Nepal from a feudal kingdom into a modern democracy, to build schools, hospitals, roads, to give land to the farmers and dignity to the poor. And for a brief, shining moment, it seemed possible. But history is rarely kind to dreamers. Only 18 months after taking office, BP Koirala's government was dismissed by King Mahendra in December 1960. The accusation? Corruption. The truth? Fear. For the monarchy could not bear the rise of a people's government, nor the idea of power being taken from royal hands and placed into the hands of the people. Soldiers marched into his residence. BP was arrested. Along with him, his entire cabinet was jailed. For the second time in his life, BP Koirala found himself behind bars. But this time, it was in his own homeland at the hands of his own king. The dream of democracy had been cut short. And yet, in those prison walls, BP remained unbroken. He read, he wrote, he dreamed. He began drafting novels and political essays. He believed that even if his voice was silenced, his words would one day rise again, carried by future generations. After years of imprisonment, BP was released but forced into exile in India. Once again he became a wanderer between worlds, a Nepali heart beating in foreign soil. But exile did not mean surrender. From across the border, he continued to inspire movements within Nepal. His speeches, his writings, his presence alone became a threat to authoritarian rule. Imagine the scene: a modest man, often dressed simply in white kurta, walking among students, farmers, activists. No security, no palace guards. Just a frail-looking figure with fire in his words. And yet, thousands would gather not to see a king, but to hear a man who lived like them, who understood their struggles. BP could have chosen comfort in India. He could have lived as a respected intellectual, writing novels, enjoying literary fame. But his heart refused. Again and again he attempted to return to Nepal, despite threats, despite knowing prison awaited him. For him, democracy was not an option. It was destiny. What made BP Koirala extraordinary was not just his politics, but his philosophy. He believed that true leadership was rooted in simplicity. He owned little. He valued honesty over wealth. He once said, "A leader who seeks luxury can never serve the people." These were not just words, they were his way of life. While others built empires of money, BP built legacies of ideas. While dictators surrounded themselves with pomp, BP sat under trees with villagers, listening to their stories. He saw politics not as a career but as service. And service, he believed, demanded sacrifice. Even in prison he refused to bend. Even in exile he refused to beg. His life became a paradox. The more power he was denied, the more powerful his example became. In 1976, after years of exile, BP made a bold decision. He announced that he would return to Nepal, openly, without secrecy, without fear. His plan was called the National Reconciliation Policy, a call for unity between monarchists and democrats for the sake of Nepal's future. The announcement shook the regime. Here was a man who had been dismissed, jailed, exiled, and yet he returned, not with vengeance but with reconciliation. Crowds lined the streets as he entered Nepal. For the people, it was like watching a legend step back into reality. But the regime responded with the same iron hand. BP was immediately arrested upon arrival. Once again the dream was crushed. And yet, his return was not in vain. His courage ignited hope across the nation. It told the people, democracy may sleep but it cannot die. By the late 1970s, BP was an old man. His health began to fail. Cancer gnawed at his body but not at his spirit. He spent his final years in and out of hospital, but continued to write, continued to dream, continued to speak of a Nepal that was free, equal, and just. In July 1982, BP Koirala breathed his last. Nepal lost not just a leader but a soul. A man who could have lived like a king but chose to live like a commoner. A man who could have sought revenge but chose reconciliation. A man who walked barefoot, but whose footsteps still echo in Nepal's democracy today. What is legacy? For some, it is monuments. For others, it is power. But for BP Koirala, it was simplicity. His novels still inspire. His speeches still move. His vision still guides. He showed that politics could be poetry, and that poetry could be revolution. Today, when Nepal struggles, people still whisper his words. When leaders falter, people still remember his humility. And when democracy trembles, the people recall that once, there was a prime minister who lived like them, dreamed like them, and never betrayed them. BP Koirala remains more than a historical figure. He remains a reminder that true greatness is not in crowns, not in riches, not in power. It is in simplicity. It is in courage. It is in the refusal to surrender. In the shadow of the Himalayas, his story is still told. The story of a man who was jailed by kings, rejected by power, exiled by fear, and yet remembered as the father of Nepali democracy. He was a poet. He was a dreamer. He was a prime minister who chose to remain a servant. This is the story of BP Koirala, Nepal's humble giant. While the world remembers BP Koirala as a politician, few realize how much of his heart belonged to literature. Even in prison, surrounded by iron bars and watchful eyes, he wrote. Pages after pages, in tiny handwriting with smuggled pens and scraps of paper, he created stories that were part autobiography, part social commentary, and part pure poetry. One of his most famous works, Shweta Bervi, written during his imprisonment, is not just a novel. It is a meditation on life, suffering, and philosophy. In it, he weaves tales of human desire, spirituality, and the fragility of existence. Through fiction he expressed what politics could not capture. He once said, "When the voice is silenced in politics, The pen must speak in literature. And indeed, his pen spoke with thunder. These writings kept him alive. They kept his ideas alive. And later they kept his memory alive. For generations of Nepalis who could not hear him speak, his books became the echo of his voice. The late 1970s brought with them a unique chapter in BP's life. Though frail in body, he crafted what would become his most daring political idea, the National Reconciliation Policy. It was radical, even shocking. Instead of demanding revenge on the monarchy that had jailed him, he extended his hand. Instead of calling for blood, he called for peace. Instead of seeking division, he sought unity. Why? Because BP understood something profound, that nations do not survive on hatred, that democracy cannot grow in the soil of vengeance. He believed that only through dialogue between monarchy and the democratic forces could Nepal survive as a stable nation. His critics mocked him. Some accused him of weakness. Others called him a traitor to his own sacrifices. But history would later reveal his wisdom. For reconciliation is not surrender, it is courage. It is choosing the harder path when the easier one is revenge. Behind the speeches, behind the prison walls, behind the novels, BP Koirala was still a man of flesh and blood. He battled with illness, often coughing blood in prison. He felt loneliness in exile, missing his homeland's mountains. He wrote letters to family where he confessed his fears, his doubts, his longing to walk freely in the villages of Nepal again. There were nights when despair touched him. Nights when he wondered if his sacrifices were in vain. But even then he never gave up. He would write in his diary, "If I must die, let me die with the satisfaction that I did not betray my people." These words show us that even heroes are human, but it is their refusal to surrender to despair that makes them immortal. BP was not just a Nepali leader. He was a global thinker. He studied world politics closely, drawing lessons from leaders like Gandhi, Nehru, and even Western philosophers. He admired socialism but rejected authoritarian communism. He supported democracy but warned against blind capitalism. He believed Nepal must walk its own path, not blindly imitate others. At international conferences, he spoke with conviction, even when Nepal was a small, fragile nation. He reminded the world that democracy was not the property of the West. It was a universal human aspiration. And he lived that belief. In him, Nepal's voice reached the world stage. When BP Koirala died in 1982, Nepal mourned. Crowds gathered. Thousands cried. But his death was not an end. It was a beginning. For the seeds he had planted began to grow. His disciples, his followers, the students who once heard him under trees, they carried his dream forward. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, Nepal saw the return of democracy. The panchayat system collapsed. Multi-party democracy was restored. And when the nation celebrated freedom, it was BP's face, his words, his sacrifices that people remembered. In many ways he won, even after death. His body was gone, but his spirit marched on with the people. And that is the greatest victory a leader can achieve. Today, when Nepalis debate politics, when they dream of freedom, when they criticize corruption, when they demand equality, they are, knowingly or unknowingly, speaking in the voice of BP Koirala. His philosophy of simplicity stands as a challenge to every corrupt leader who seeks wealth. His courage stands as an example to every activist who feels hopeless. His writings stand as a beacon to every young dreamer who wonders if words can change the world. In the end, BP Koirala remains a paradox. A poet who became a politician. A prisoner who became prime minister. A dreamer who never stopped fighting. A man of immense suffering and yet immense hope. He reminds us that one man can indeed move mountains, not with armies, not with weapons, but with truth. As the Himalayan winds whisper through Nepal, they still carry his name. Bishweshwar Prasad Koirala. The prime minister who chose simplicity. The prisoner who chose freedom. The poet who chose his people. His story is not just history, it is a living flame, reminding us all that true power lies not in crowns, not in wealth, but in courage, simplicity, and sacrifice.